Hello and welcome to St Anne's Church Mile End Studio. Thank you to Matt for doing that reading. We're looking today at the next instalment of the story of Jacob, which is part of the story of God's people in the Old Testament in the Bible. In today's section we'll see three things. We'll see two things and we'll ask a question. We'll see that God is faithful to his promises. We'll see that Jacob is not a lost cause. And we'll ask, who do you put your trust in? It's nice to see familiar faces, isn't it? Mine? Well, I'm familiar to many of you, and you'll see that I'm every bit as handsome as ever. And you? Well, I can't actually see you, and I miss you. This sermon today has been written and will be delivered during the coronavirus lockdown, and I hope and pray that it is relevant to that situation. But I think we're all missing seeing familiar faces at the moment, and it will be good when we can meet for real, in person, and not be seeing each other on screen on YouTube or on Zoom. The familiar faces we see in today's passage are Jacob and Laban. They're familiar because we've seen them before. We know a little bit about their characters. Jacob is the deceiver. He's the trickster. He's the runty younger kid who's fooled his big, bad older brother Esau out of the family birthright twice. He's deceived his dad Isaac. He's run away to see his uncle Laban. And he was given an amazing set of promises by God on the way. What sort of promises? He was promised a special relationship with God. He was promised lots of descendants. And he was promised a land of his own. You can read all about it back in Genesis chapter 28, 3 chapters previously. Or have a listen back about a month ago. Listen to the online recording. Christians aren't all a bunch of good, pious people who do good all the time. Jacob is the proof of that. But the promises from God never depend upon the character of the person they're made to. Laban is Jacob's uncle, and he's the slippery guy who tricked the trickster into marrying the wrong daughter, ugly Leah, after spending 7 years in near slavery tending his sheep. The wrong daughter was thankfully joined by the right daughter, which is pretty Rachel, and the 7 years of hard labour became 20 years of hard labour, during which time, with some decidedly iffy attempts at genetic engineering of sheep, allowed Jacob to make both himself and Laban quite rich. And as we heard from John in his good sermon last week, God had big plans for Jacob. Jacob was in a real miserable situation. He was a near slave to his uncle, who had properly diddled him over the whole bride's business. He was stuck in a foreign land, under the thumb of a relative who almost certainly hated him. But Jacob wasn't going to let that present reality define him. Those promises from God were still real and still relevant. 20 years on, God seemed to be pretty absent, but that's going to change. In last week's passage, we see God talking to Jacob again, first time for 20 years. Chapter 31, verses 10 to 13. God appeared in a dream to Jacob, saying, "Leave this land at once and go back to your native land." Jacob was obedient. In verse 17 and 18, he put his wives and his kids on camels, and he left Haran, which was Laban's country. He made good his exit, but not before his favourite wife stole a set of household gods from her father, back in verse 19. And that's where we find him this week. Jacob is fleeing Laban as quick as he possibly can. Jacob didn't tell him he was leaving, in verse 20, but Laban heard of the plan, and an epic chase ensued. 7 days, uphill, down dale. This is the closing scenes of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Jacob and his family arrive in a small town. They're surrounded by Laban's much bigger posse. Jacob's in fear for his life, and there's a showdown between the leaders of the two main parties. Jacob and Laban, there, 1-to-1, right there in verse 26. You can cut the tension with a knife when Laban starts speaking out, but as with so much of the Bible, it's much more powerful and has much more meaning when you dig below the surface to understand what's really being said. Jacob seems to have started to listen to God again. We saw this in last week's passage. And God makes himself known to Laban as well, just before this showdown. Verse 24, he essentially warns Laban off from doing anything untoward to Jacob. God's words to Laban in the dream were, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." He's saying, leave Jacob alone. He's mine. And you can hear those words ringing in Laban's ears when he embarks upon his pre-prepared speech in verse 26. Laban has had the 7 days of the pursuit to think about this speech, and he will have chosen his words carefully. To say it's oily is an understatement, but then Laban always was a bit of a slippery character. I, Laban, have been robbed, and you, Jacob, have done a bad thing. I'm a loving father, I'm a great-grandfather, and if only you told me you were leaving, I'd have organised a really nice big farewell party for you. Do we remember the last time Laban organised a really nice big party for Jacob? Yeah, halfway through chapter 29. And yes, Jacob woke up the next morning married to the wrong daughter. Laban continues, Look, I haven't even been allowed to kiss my 12 grandsons goodbye. Poor Laban. But our sympathy starts to evaporate quite quickly with the threat of the next sentence. I have the power to harm you. I have the power to do you harm. So why doesn't he, if he's been so badly wronged by Jacob? The answer is in his dream. Last night the God of your father warned me off doing anything to hurt you. Laban is a regional bigwig. He was an established member of the local squirearchy when Jacob rolled into his town 20 years ago, and he's become wealthier and more successful since. But he's in a corner. His daughters have pledged allegiance to their foreign husband, and his meal ticket Jacob, whose slavery had made him considerably wealthier, was getting the hell out of Dodge as quickly as he could, under the protection of a God whom Laban didn't know, but whose power he seemed quite afraid of. And that's the first point from this week's passage. God, the true God, the God of Isaac's father and the God of St. Anne's, is faithful, and the protection of Jacob that he's offering is the first of many, many steps towards fulfilling the promises made to him back in chapter 28. Laban is in a corner, and he plays the one card he has left to play. Why did you steal my gods? He's acknowledged the power of Jacob's God, but to steal a household's gods is a serious charge. What were these gods? They would have been small figures of some kind, called teraphim. They could have been used for many purposes. They would be superstitious good luck charms. They might have been used for fortune telling. They may have been used for protection. They could have been a form of family inheritance. Why did Rachel steal them? We don't know. But Jacob realizes the seriousness of the charge when we hear his response to Laban. Laban's speech would have been well rehearsed during those 7 days bouncing around on the back of his camel, as would have been Jacob's answer. And it's a fair one. I was afraid. I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. Laban is by far the more powerful one of these two, and Jacob realizes that his departure with both Leah and Rachel would probably anger Laban significantly. And in saying what he does, it's also clear that he doesn't think that Laban's previous words were true. But you can hear the slight surprise in his voice when he goes on to say what he does in verse 32. If you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. Gods? What gods, Laban? What are you talking about? If you can find your gods anywhere in my party, the person who has them won't survive to tell the tale, and you can take your gods back. A brave and bold statement from the new look, true God-fearing Jacob, and one which we can see as sentencing his favourite wife to death. Jacob is a man with an awful lot of faults, but he's trying to do the right thing here. He has no interest in Laban's gods because he trusts in the perfect and all-powerful God. He has no desire to steal from Laban and is keen to show his innocence, hence this rash gesture. And that's the second point from this passage. Jacob is not a lost cause. He's not going to be defined by the messy situation he's in last week, a slave to Uncle Laban, because with God's promises he has a future and he has a hope. The details of this are very unclear at the moment, but those promises and God's commands are what are driving Jacob at the moment. But the story gets darker. If we had a sinister threat from Laban in verse 29, it set the tone for the search that follows. Jacob offers the life of whoever stole the gods, and you can feel the tension rising as Laban searches for them. Verse 33, he goes into Jacob's tent. And then he goes into Leah's tent. And then he goes into the tent of the maidservants. And in verse 34, he goes into Rachel's tent. Rachel, Jacob's favourite wife. Rachel, the head turner. Rachel, the thief. Rachel, who looks like she's learnt some of the trickster ways from her husband in the last 13 years of marriage. Rachel, who realises the danger she is in and shoves the stolen gods into her seat, making a singularly lame excuse to her father as she turns the tone of the whole scene from sinister to farce. "Sorry, Dad, can't stand up, it's my time of the month." Laban's in a corner. We know that. He's hunting for his gods, and he's fooled by one of the daughters he spent the last 7 days pursuing with a trick that's so transparent it's untrue. Back in chapter 29, Laban out-tricked Jacob, and we all had a bit of a giggle at Jacob's expense. Chapter 31, Laban is out-tricked by his own daughter, and we have to have a giggle at Laban's expense. But we're not only giggling at Laban's expense here. We have to giggle at the expense of the gods who were hidden. A true God is surely a mighty figure, a powerful figure, a God who can condemn or who can save, a God who can protect or a God who can ensnare. And Laban's gods in this story are so pathetic they need to be hidden by our women lest they be found. If I rootle around in my seat, I might pull something out. Then what would you find? A TV remote controller, perhaps? And if I look in here, there's an old sock. Any god I find there is going to be surely a pitiful thing indeed. And the gods who ostensibly prompted Laban's cross-country pursuit are revealed as being little more use than sanitary towels. And that's the question raised by this story. Who do you put your trust in? Jacob and Laban are the two main characters of this story. Laban seems to be hedging his bets about who to trust. God tells him in verse 24 not to say anything either good or bad to Jacob, and he obeys. But he's more concerned about his own gods, the teraphim whom Rachel hid. And when he refers to the true God, the God of Jacob, he scoffs at him by calling him by a number of different names. The God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor. Who is Laban trusting in here? This service isn't being done live. Coronavirus means that you're watching this on YouTube. And I don't know who you are. I don't know who's watching this. I know we have a lot of people who are part of St. Anne's watching, but I also know there are a number of people who don't call themselves part of our church. That doesn't matter. It's great to have you. But whoever you are, who do you put your trust in, now in lockdown and at other times? A lot of people are putting their trust in science at the moment, the finding of a vaccine, or the statistical probability that they or their loved ones won't catch the virus. Some people are putting their trust in the NHS, which is something of a modern religion. If I get ill, then the NHS will save me. But none of these promise anything. There may never be a coronavirus vaccine. Statistically, you might catch COVID-19 and you might die. The NHS has never promised to save anyone. And if you look at Laban, then maybe you'll see yourself hedging your bets, while perhaps scoffing slightly at those who claim to trust in the one true God. If you aren't yet trusting in God, then please also go and have a look at Jacob. He's no angel, but he has God's promises to rely on. If we go back to chapter 28, we can see he's been promised many descendants. He's been promised much land, a land of his own. And he's promised that God will be with him and will watch over him. And between chapter 28 and here in chapter 31, we can see those promises are starting to come true. He's gained 2 wives. He's gained 13 children, that's 12 sons and a daughter. He's making his way back to the land of his forefathers. And God is very much watching over him. God's promises were made 20 years previously, but they are as valid and as reliable the day they were made, and we can see them starting to work out for Jacob. So if you're scoffing slightly at the notion of God, I'd ask why. We can see him as one who is reliable to keep his promises, and the one who means well for those to whom he's made them, here in this story and throughout the Bible. Let's finish off this week's passage. The rest of the story is quite quickly told. When Laban failed to find his gods, then Jacob properly takes him to task. Verses 36 to 41, he asks what he has done wrong that Laban should hunt him down. What has Laban found that was stolen? But answer, nothing. Jacob then rails against Laban about the way he's been treated for the last 20 years. While Jacob was caring for both his and Laban's flocks, it seems that Jacob was making good any losses from Laban's flocks with animals from his own. Verse 39. Verse 40 tells us that Jacob had worked very hard despite difficult conditions, and he wasn't treated honestly by Laban there in verse 41. Who has upheld Jacob? It's God, who saw his work and his hardship, and without whose oversight Laban would surely have sent Jacob away empty-handed. Laban has been tough on Jacob. It's only God who's preserved him. All this takes Laban somewhat by surprise. He has no prepared speech to reply to Jacob's accusation. All he can do is bluster. His reply in 43 is a climb down, worded to avoid too many blushes on anyone's behalf, least of all his own, and a deliberate attempt to put the embarrassing past behind him and make peace. Laban is the one at the negotiating table with the larger number of men, but he is shamed by the truth of his own actions over the last 20 years. Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, let it serve as a witness between us, is a far cry from, I have the power to do you harm, back in verse 29. They build a pile of stones called a Jagar Sagadutha, or Gilead, both of which mean witness heap, the idea being that the heap of stones is a witness to the agreement they are making. However, even in doing this, you can see Laban's distrust. The heap was also called a Mizpah, which is a Hebrew word for a watchtower, and a Mizpah is never a good thing. Laban is saying that God would watch over Jacob, and if Jacob, should break the agreement they're making, then God would punish him, probably by death. Which God Laban is appealing to in this situation isn't clear, but the sentiment is abundantly clear, and it's not one of trust. And there the passage ends. Jacob and Laban and all their various people seal the deal with a sacrifice, which is pretty traditional. They have a good barbecue, and the following morning Laban's wish to kiss his daughters and grandchildren goodbye was fulfilled, and off they go on their separate ways. This week's passage isn't a story on its own. It's another chapter in a much larger story. We don't come across Laban in the Bible again, so we don't know what's happened to him. But Jacob is carrying God's promises, which were just starting to be fulfilled. He was leaving slavery with Laban, which we can see has been exhausting work. He's going home. However, when he fled from home 20 years earlier, he fled his very angry older brother Esau, from whom he had stolen the birthright, who was a skilled hunter and who was bent on killing him. He fled from his old and infirm father, who preferred his brother to him, and it's not at all clear what Jacob will be going back to. But on the way he's picked up some very significant promises from God, and we can now see those promises starting to be fulfilled. So, we've seen that God is faithful to his promises, despite all that Jacob has done. We've seen that Jacob is not a lost cause. He's started to listen to God again, and he appears to be obeying what God tells him to do. He acquits himself well in front of Laban, and he seems to be turning back to God. So I want to leave you with the question, who do you trust in for your future, for your health, for your security? Do you believe and trust in the God of the Bible, who is the God of St. Anne's? Or do you have other God or gods? Money, the NHS, your own abilities, perhaps you trust in your friends. Everyone trusts in something. And if you're wondering whether your God is at risk of letting you down, we'd be delighted to talk to you further about a God whose promises are utterly reliable and trustworthy. Let's pray. Lord, times are strange, but while we're not in the normal world, you are still with us. Jacob had a rough 20 years with Laban, but had promises from you to hold on to, and you were there with him during the rough times. May we also look to the future and the promises of heaven you make to us, reliable and trustworthy promises. Be with us, we pray. Amen.